Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, good morning, whatever the case may be. This is the makeup lecture for class 18. Depending on if you're in section 5, 6, 7, or 8, this could be the makeup class for Thursday, November the 3rd, or Friday, November the 4th. Either way, thank you very much for checking out Cyber Campus online lectures and listening to today's talk. In our last class, I started discussing how to write compare and contrast essays. We looked at the two sample essays in the book, The Dream of Flight and Two Chemicals That Have Changed Lives. And I had you choose paired subjects and then brainstorm some bases of comparison and list some similarities and differences. And I think in one of my classes, a student had mentioned comparing Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Nazi Germany during World War II, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of Soviet Union era Russia. And I think this was a good example of where the idea of compare and contrast can actually be taken out of just a regular essay and turned into a whole book. I happen to have here this book, which I read. I'll just hold it up here so you can see it. This I bought from a used bookstore a couple of years ago, and it's called The Dictators. It's by Professor Richard Overy. It's the winner of the Wolfson Prize for History. And it's quite an interesting read. It's about 700 pages or so. So it's a heavy, heavy text, but it takes a look at these two individuals and how they ruled their country. It compares and contrasts their ruling styles, how they organized their political party, how they tried to construct a utopia in their country, their use of cultural revolution, their moral universe as they understood it, their use of military force, how they went about overseeing war, and a number of other things. Absolutely excellent. But today I want to talk about something else, and this is going to lead up to your fourth writing assignment. This is the biggest writing assignment of the semester, so I hope you will enjoy it. I'm going to be talking about generations. Now, you might recall how in the previous one of our previous classes, actually, I talked about Generation Z. There's an interesting article in our textbook, which is called Your Guide to Generation Z, the brand-weary anti-millennials. And it talks about how companies are trying to market products to young people, and they have to try different strategies than they would if they were marketing to either Generation X or Generation Y or the baby boomers. Well, today I want to take a look at a few different generations, the baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, also Generation Z, and see if we can not only pick out some very interesting bases of comparison, but also notice how these generations have got some very striking similarities as well as some very interesting differences. And from that, hopefully we can gain a deeper understanding into what makes people of different generations think. Why do they look at the world the way they do? Why do they have the opinions that they do? And why do they constantly misunderstand each other? I hope you enjoy this lecture, and I'll try not to go off on a tangent or get lost in a digression, which I often seem to do. So let's get started. Before I begin the lecture proper, let me give a quick introduction. So today I'm going to talk about generations. In particular, the baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y, and Generation Z. I want to look at a number of different bases of comparison. These will include pop culture, significant events, for example, historical events, social cultural factors, social movements, the influence of new technology, the sense of nostalgia. This is something that I think almost all generations have in common, and also politics. There will be a few other ones that I will mention here and there, but those are the most important ones. Okay, so before I get started, I also just want to make a little note here that I will be making some very broad generalizations about people of different generations. And I think this is inevitable. If you're going to talk about groups of people that include millions and millions of individuals, and the only thing that they have in common is that they were all born within the same 10 or 15-year bracket, this is obviously going to create some inaccuracies. People are different, and some people have argued that even the concept of generations is faulty, that generations as we understand them don't even exist. But for the purpose of this lecture, we are going to say that generations exist, and we're going to use these categories, baby boomer, Generation X, Generation Y, and Generation Z, to make some very general comments about people that grew up in certain places and certain times. The difference, I think, between a generalization and a stereotype is that a stereotype is a substitute for analysis. You just say, for example, baby boomers are out of touch, Generation Xers are cynical, Generation Yers are a little bit, what would be too soft, and Generation Z has an attention span of only 10 seconds. Obviously, this is true for some people, but not true for others. Stereotypes are a substitute for an analysis, whereas a generalization is just a starting point for deeper observations. I think I'll leave it with that. Yeah, the history of the generation gap. For the last several generations, at least, as technology has developed more and more quickly, and society has changed at an ever-increasing speed, it's become very common to talk about a generation gap, meaning that one generation is so vastly different from another that they can't understand people that are older than them or younger than them. And you can see this not only in changing fashion, music, technology, but how different youth identities are formed over the years in different generations. Okay, yeah, a quick note about the links in this presentation. I could easily turn this lecture into a 5-hour presentation with lots of different YouTube videos that I think are very good for exploring certain ideas in more depth. And I've included a number of links in this presentation. You are by no means obligated to find this PowerPoint on Cyber Campus and then click on the links and watch the videos. But if you are interested in some of the issues that I do bring up, by all means, check out some of the links. I think some of the videos are quite interesting. Okay, so today I will be talking about the baby boomers, Generation X, the millennials, and Generation Z. The baby boomers, they were the generation born in the post-World War II baby boom. Generation X, and wow, he really does look like me. The generation also known as Generation Bust because of their birth rate. This was when the birth rate began to slow down. They were born between 1965 and 1979. The millennials, born between 1980 and 1995, they were the generation that slowly reached adulthood in the 21st century. They're also known, I guess, as digital pioneers, which is a label that I strongly disagree with. And then there's Generation Z. You fine, ladies and gentlemen. The generation hailed as the first true digital natives, or screenagers, which I think is an interesting term, screenagers. Okay, so what is a generation? When we talk about a generation, we are talking about people that are of similar ages. Usually there's a 10 to 15 year category for a generation. And this is especially true when we consider that people in a certain generation share the same experiences or attitudes. And the experiences and the attitudes that they have make them distinct from the generation that preceded them and the one that follows them. People in a given generation grow up surrounded by the same technology at roughly the same age, also the same fashion and popular culture. They might not like the fashion. They might not always use the technology that's available. They might not be interested in all parts of the popular culture, but because they grow up in that time, in that place, they can't help but be influenced by it. The link that I have here at the bottom of this slide, I think, is of the Who's performance of the song My Generation at the 1967 Monterey Festival. If you want to see how Western teenagers looked in the late 1960s and what concerts were like, check it out, especially the end of the performance. Okay, so we're going to start off with the baby boomers here. And these are some of the most distinctive images that come out of that time. You've got the Beatles and Elvis Presley. So we've got the birth and development of rock and roll, a distinct rebellious youth culture. We have the increasing popularity of cars as a consumer good, in particular, young people owning and driving cars. We have the first humans going to the moon. There, we've got the moon landing, and unless that's the Russian, is that the Russian from Sputnik? I'm not sure. And Martin Luther King, as well as Walt Disney and JFK. So what have we got here? The baby boomers, they were born after World War II. So World War II ended, and all the men came back. They made lots of babies. They got married, and they all got married, and they had lots of kids. The term is used to categorize a large group of people born after World War II. And when we think about the baby boomers when they were young, there were a number of notable aspects. Sex, in particular, sex before marriage, which became much more common. The use of drugs as part of youth culture. Rock and roll as a form of youth identity. War and protest, increasing divorce as they got older, space exploration, and as they got older and older, and now the baby boomers are retiring, they're perceived by following generations as being greedy, materialistic, ambitious, and out of touch with younger generations. The term "okay boomer" is now a pejorative, and it's used to denote that an older person is increasingly out of touch. One of the most notable aspects of the mid-1960s in the United States was the legalization of the birth control pill, which might not seem like a big deal now in 2022, but in 1965, this was a revolutionary thing, the idea that women now had control of their ability to have children, or if they did not want to have children. Beyond that, drugs and drug culture. As young people grew up and social mores began to loosen, it became increasingly common for Western teenagers to experiment or habitually use certain drugs, such as marijuana, LSD, and to use these drugs not only for entertainment and pleasure, but also as sources of artistic inspiration. When people think of music that the baby boomer generation produced or that they listened to, as a big fan of this, I think I'll have to mention a few of these. I like to believe that the late 1960s was an amazing explosion of artistic creativity that really did take advantage of the somewhat limited recording technology, but use it to its furthest possible potential. You have the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Pink Floyd, the Doors, the Velvet Underground. Who else have we got in here? Jimi Hendrix, Simon and Garfunkel. If you haven't heard of some of these artists, I strongly recommend that you check out some of the albums that I have listed here. The music that came out, I think, not only defined the generation, but in many ways, artistically, has rarely been matched and never surpassed. Also a significant movement within the United States within the 1960s was the Civil Rights Movement, spearheaded by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who once famously said, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be not judged by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character." And the protests and meetings that were held by the Reverend Martin Luther King, among others, were not only some of the most notable events of the 1960s, but sadly, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in the late 1960s was also a shared experience among the baby boomers. And one thing that I'm going to be coming back to in this lecture is that idea of a shared experience. TV, newspapers, and magazines allowed people to learn about certain social movements and certain events, and in a way, people were able to experience them collectively in a way that had been not as easily possible in previous generations. Here is the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. at the Capitol, where there's a huge protest in the 1960s, and he made a very touching speech. It would be impossible to do a presentation about the United States or Western culture in general and the 1960s and the baby boomers without mentioning the Vietnam War and the subsequent protests regarding the military conflict in Southeast Asia. Without getting into a long lecture about the military conflict itself, I think socially, one of the most significant things to come out of the protests regarding the war in Vietnam was a profound sense of distrust of the government. This might have come from contradictions between what people saw on the news, where they saw that the United States military was clearly not winning the military conflict, but the government continued to tell them that things were getting better and that the light at the end of the tunnel was coming soon. And this led to a profound disillusionment with government, which many commentators believe has never quite been fixed. If you look in the 2020s, it's quite common for people to have a great sense of mistrust of their government, in particular if an opposing party is in office. This phenomenon, although it might not have started in the 1960s, protests over the war greatly exacerbated it. Okay, before I continue on, I thought I'd just mention a few songs of protest and dissent from what is known as the only war to have its own soundtrack. I mentioned that the 1960s had an amazing abundance of not only high quality musicians, but also great songs. Here are just some of them in terms of topical matter. We Got to Get Out of This Place by the Animals. War, What Is It Good For by Edwin Starr. Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon and the Plastic Ono Band. Fortunate Son by CCR. For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield. Painted Black by the Rolling Stones. And The Star-Spangled Banner by Jimi Hendrix. If you're at all interested in the musical legacy of the 1960s, please check out these songs and others on YouTube. They really do capture the spirit of the time. And if there's one thing which I believe future generations are jealous of, it's that the songs from the 1960s were clearly inspired by the events of the 1960s. There is a context to the art. Okay, moving into the late 1960s, I mentioned before shared events. The moon landing, where Neil Armstrong stepped off the spaceship or off the rocket and said, "One small step for a man and one giant leap for mankind." This was something which was experienced by millions of people. And if you ask people, where were you? They'll just say, I was at home watching it. But it was something which everybody was able to see and created this shared sense of a cultural event, I guess. As the baby boomers grew older, a lot of them married and had children, and as time went on, an increasing number of them got divorced. And if you take a look at this graph here, where you can see the divorce rate by age group, you can see as the 1960s went into the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, the divorce rates went very, very high. Now, who were the children of these divorced families? Well, that's my generation, Generation X. So we're now going to move from the baby boomers on to Generation X, also known as the MTV generation, who are described as directionless, cynical, disaffected, also known as the first latchkey kids. The term latchkey kid refers to children who went home after school and they were alone. This was because life was getting increasingly expensive, so it was much more common for both the mother and the father to work outside the home. As a result of this, a lot of young Gen Xers felt that they were raising themselves. They felt they didn't have the same support of their parents that previous generations had had. This refers to people born between 1965 and the late 1970s, and that means that your humble professor, me, I was born in 1975. I'm in the second half of that generation. In case you're wondering where the term Generation X came from, as far as I know, it comes from the novel Generation X, Tales for an Accelerated Culture, which was written by Douglas Copeland, who was born and resides in my hometown of beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia. And this is a novel which looks at a number of young people growing up in the 1980s and early 1990s. And it takes a look at how they feel very, not hopeless, but there's a definite sense that their future will not be as bright as their parents. And the sense of feeling quite a bit of limitations in terms of their future aspirations. They were the first generation, I think, to really feel that. Okay, so what about Generation X? Dual income families became much more common. The divorce rate, as I mentioned, increased, so there was an increasing number of single parents. A personal example, when I was in elementary school, as I went through elementary school and into middle school, it became increasingly popular or increasingly common for kids in my class to have just one parent. We also had the end of the Cold War, the end of the 1980s. We got to see the Berlin Wall in Germany fall down. We got to see the collapse of the Soviet Union. Towards the end of the 20th century, we had Y2K, which I'll be talking about in just a moment. We were also the first generation to not do as well financially as our parents, and we grew up with a strong sense of nostalgia for the 1950s and the 1960s. This is something I'll be coming back to a little bit later in the lecture. A lot of generations feel a sense of nostalgia for what came before. Now, they look at their previous, maybe their parents' generation, and feel there's a sense that things were better. It was a kinder, simpler time. And my generation is no exception. We look back to the 1950s and 1960s with a great deal of nostalgia, a time that we never experienced ourselves directly, but we could experience indirectly through music and various other forms of entertainment media. A lot of movies, for example. We often had this idealized or romanticized image of the past. Yeah. Okay, so I'll skip on to, here we are, advanced technology, Generation X style. It's quite logical, I guess, that people growing up seem to think that the technology in their current generation is the best that things have ever been. And Generation X was no exception. We felt that we had access to technology which put us head and shoulders above our parents. And we had inventions which, well, you'll see what I mean in just a moment. This is a meme which I found, which I think resonates with a lot of older Generation Xers today. Some of the things that nobody said in the 1980s. I lost my phone. Beyond that, we have the Sony Walkman. This was considered an amazing invention. You no longer needed to stay at home and listen to music on a stereo, whether it be a cassette player or a turntable. Now you could walk around, listen to whatever music you wanted to, and nobody else would need to hear it. So walking to school or walking around town, being on the bus, we were the first generation that could walk around and have our own private sources of music. Not only that, but we didn't need to go to the movie theater in order to see movies, and we were not limited by what was on TV. There was an increasing number of video rental stores where you could go and rent videos and then buy blank tapes and tape programs off the TV and watch them later. We felt that we had a much greater sense of control over the media that we were consuming. Okay, a quick look into 80s music and pop culture. One of the definitive albums of the 1980s, I think here, this is Madonna's Like a Virgin. Something about pop stars in the 1980s, there was a strong emphasis on looking good, being beautiful, being glamorous. Here's another group that was popular in the 1980s, New Kids on the Block. One of the first, I guess, real popular boy bands of the era. Whitney Houston, who had a really long string of hits, including I Will Always Love You. And if you would like to have perhaps one of the greatest symbols of what it meant to be a 1980s pop star, this is George Michael. You can see the perfect hair, the sunglasses, the leather jacket. The idea of looking good, being glamorous, being highly successful, and this being an ideal to reach toward was something which became increasingly strong throughout the 1980s and then would crash as the 1990s dawned. Oh, by the way, here is something which has often been lost to history, the glam rock genre. This here is a group called Poison, which I saw twice in concert. It's very common for men to dress up in highly feminine, shall we say, style clothing, as well as to have long teased hair, wear lipstick, and so on and so forth. Just to give you an example of how this played out in everyday life, this is a picture of my bus pass from middle school. And you can see I had a hairstyle which was called the mullet. This is where your hair is long, going down the back, but relatively short in the front. Or as we used to say, business up front, party in the back. By the early 1990s, however, things were beginning to turn. And rather than aspiring to be glamorous, the idea of being troubled or downtrodden and became the new cool. And suddenly everyone went from trying to wear very shiny clothes to wearing flannel shirts. A lot of this came about as a result of probably one of the most popular groups of the 1990s. I've posted a picture of them here. You can see them. Now, you might look at these three men and think that, oh, they don't look like pop stars. Well, an interesting thing is that they created some of the most popular music of the early 1990s, and all in all sold 75 million albums, including an album called Nevermind, which is one of the definitive generations of Generation X. Okay, watching the world on TV. You might remember that I spoke about shared cultural moments where people through TV and other forms of media experience certain historical moments, and these sort of bring everyone together in a sense of collective experience. Well, here are a few that Generation X would never forget. I mentioned this earlier, the Berlin Wall. One of the greatest symbols of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was the war that separated Berlin. You had East Germany and West Germany. Well, in the late 1980s, East Germany collapsed. Germany was reunified, and the wall came down. People chopped off pieces of it, hacked off pieces, chiseled off pieces. They climbed on top of the wall, and there was this anecdote that I heard where a man went from either the east to the west or the west to the east, and he asked somebody for directions to a park. Do you know how to get to this park? And somebody said, yes, I can tell you how to get there, but it's quite a long walk. Are you sure you want to walk there? And the man said, I've waited 28 years to take this walk because it had been so long since the country had been unified. And there were other moments that were quite memorable too. The Soviet Union collapsed, and we watched communism fall in a number of different countries. These were things that we could see happening on the news each night, and they became part of our collective memory. Now let's move on to popular movies. What were some of the movies that defined Generation X? What did we go and see? What was popular? There were a lot of teen movies. Here's a really great example, The Breakfast Club. This is the story of 5 high school students that have to spend a Saturday, I think all Saturday, from Saturday morning to Saturday afternoon, in detention. Each student has done something bad, so they have to stay in school on a Saturday in detention. And the principal of the school or the assistant principal has to stay and watch over them. Anyway, each student represents a different kind of teenager. The girl at the bottom wearing the pink shirt, she's the princess. She comes from a very rich family and she's very popular. Just above her, wearing the sports, the Letterman jacket, he's the athlete. He's also very popular. In the middle, that's with the sort of shorter blonde, dirty blonde hair, brown hair. He is the one that studies really hard. He's the nerd or the geek. He's not very popular, and yeah, he's sort of lower on the social hierarchy in the school. At the top, he's the criminal student, and to the bottom left, you have the outcast girl. And that style of clothing was quite popular for young teenagers who felt that they didn't want to fit in with society. By the end of the movie, the students have learned that although they seem to represent stereotypes, actually each person contains a little bit of the other person in their personality. So everybody is a little bit of a criminal, an outcast, a sporto, a kid who studies hard, and a princess. It's quite a good movie. I strongly recommend it. Somebody once posted on, I think, either Twitter or Instagram, that if this movie was made in the 2020s, the movie would just be the students sitting separately in a room, you know, texting on their phones, and they never would have become friends. So this is an example of the kind of movie that would not be easily made in the current generation because technology has changed, and it's changed the way we interact with each other. Okay, moving on, we've got some other really popular movies from Generation X. We've got Blade Runner, Ghostbusters, Die Hard, The Thing, and a few others. Something which was really popular during the 1980s was horror movies. It's hard to explain exactly how popular these were. For young people growing up in the 2010s and the 2020s, I guess maybe an analogy could be made to Marvel movies. Or the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you know, whether it's the Avengers, Iron Man, Spider-Man, all that stuff. But in the 1980s, you had horror movie franchises like Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. And they would come out year after year. So you would have Friday the 13th, Friday the 13th Part 2, Friday the 13th Part 3, Friday the 13th Part 4, the final chapter. Spoiler, it's not the final chapter. Friday the 13th Part 5, Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, because the hockey mask wearing killer goes to New York. because reasons. Part 9, Jason Goes to Hell. Part 10, Jason in Space. There's also been a reboot or two over the years. And there's also Nightmare on Elm Street, which was a horror franchise about a killer whose ghost now goes into the dreams of the children whose parents killed him. It's also extremely popular. People would go to see these movies, and they were quite influential. All right, moving on to the millennials. You might remember from the article that we read in class about how Generation Z are the frugal, brand-wary anti-millennials. I'm just going to bring up this point because I can. Market research suggests that Generation Z is independent, but also inclusive and tolerant. So yeah, ad campaigns that are diverse. Well, guess what? It didn't start with Generation Z. For the last couple of generations, actually, the companies in various Western countries have had ad campaigns that are increasingly diverse. And I think part of this is just the population of a lot of Western countries has become much more ethnically and culturally diverse. So companies want to get the money from these different demographics. So they've started marketing towards them. You don't just have white people in your advertising. You have Black people, Asian people, Middle Eastern people, and various other sort of subcultures and ethnicities and stuff. Why? You don't want to miss out on a market. Okay, so Generation Y, also known as the millennials. They were born between the early 1980s and the mid 1990s, maybe the early 2000s. Characteristics vary greatly by region, whether you're in North America, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, South America, Asia. Characteristics vary. Some places experienced a lot of economic growth. So the difference of a millennial in one country and a Generation X in the same country was sometimes wildly different, which made the experience of the Generation Y versus in two different countries also significantly different. But I think it's fair to say that both, I think it's fair to say that Generation Y can be characterized by an increased use and familiarity with communications, media, and also digital technologies. Let me skip on to the next one. Here we are. So what about Generation Y? They grew up with digital media. They were the first generation where it was really common for most people to have some kind of personal computer in the house. When I was growing up in Generation X, some people had computers in their house and other people didn't. And even if they did have a personal computer in their house, quite often they didn't really use it for very much. Whereas Generation Y, they have little to no memory of a time when personal computers were not common. So they can watch older movies and see people living without computers in their daily lives, but they've got very little memory of that in their own lives. The stability of the 1990s gave way to school shootings. This is particularly true in America. The terror attacks of 9/11, the war on terror, increased anxiety about the future. Divorce and single parenthood continued to be a common theme for Generation Y, just like it had been for Generation X. That's definitely one similarity. Generation Y is regarded by many as much more sheltered than previous generations, meaning that parents tried very hard to shield or protect their children from anything that might hurt them, any kind of disappointment or unpleasant realities. This is where, it's a bit of an internet meme now, schools started giving not only prizes for first place, second place, and third place in contests, but giving some kind of prize or award to everyone, a participation award. And this is something which was criticized greatly by older generations. Okay, it's also important to mention that there's a big difference between early millennials and late millennials. If you were an early millennial, you probably had a lot more in common with Generation X because you would get your first cell phone at a much later age. Whereas later millennials, people that grew up, let's say that had been born after, I don't know, 1990 or something, they became much more concerned and interested in technology related to cell phones and computers at a much younger age. Technology increased a lot in a very short time. So you can really divide actually the millennials almost into like the early millennials and the late millennials, quite distinct. Okay, watching the world online. So now we're going off into the year 2000 and beyond. For people growing up in the early 21st century, one of the obviously major events that they experienced was to watch the terror attacks on New York City on September the 11th, 2001. And it really is hard to explain how big this was and how important it was for people at the time. It's something that you really did have to be there and experience firsthand. And I don't mean firsthand in New York, I mean, but to be alive in 2001 and to see it on TV, to see it on the internet. It really was something that people will remember in one way or another for the rest of their lives. And just like the JFK assassination in 1963, I think it's very easy to ask people of the millennial generation or Generation X, where were you when you heard that the Twin Towers had been attacked? It's something that people don't forget. The video, which I've put here at the bottom of the screen, it says Super Bowl 2002. There was a tribute to the victims of the 9/11 terror attacks during the halftime show of the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is a big football game in the United States, and yeah, it's worth a watch. It's worth a watch. U2 does a couple of songs, and it's considered one of the greatest halftime performances ever by a band during the Super Bowl halftime show. Okay, moving forward a number of years, now we've got the financial crash of 2008. This is something that I had mentioned to students when we did look at the article on Generation Z. If I can go back to that here. Yeah, here we are. Yeah, you might remember where it says the generation forged during the Great Recession. In 2008, there was a massive financial collapse or the subprime mortgage crisis. It affected many countries. Lots of people lost their jobs. Some people lost their homes. It was a huge economic punch in the face, and it hurt a lot of people. And yeah, a lot of people got hurt. After that, there was another significant event, and this was the election of Barack Obama, the first Black president of the United States. Now, some people are very impressed with Obama, and they say that he did a very good job during his 8 years as president. Other people are not so impressed and say that he didn't do very much. But I think whether you like Obama or whether you liked Obama or hated Obama, I think it's impossible to deny the sense of optimism that came when he was elected. When he won the election, there really was a strong belief that things would change, that America would get out of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, that things would somehow go back to the way they had been before, or that there was going to be a much brighter future. There really was a sense of hope. And whether you think he did a good job or a bad job, well, that's what different people will have different opinions on. But the sense of optimism when he was first elected, I think that goes beyond, that's beyond question. One very small moment of his presidency that I thought was quite interesting. I believe he's the first sitting American president to visit Vietnam after the war ended. You can see him here with Anthony Bourdain in Hanoi, enjoying some noodles and drinking a beer. If you had told me when I was growing up that in, I don't know, 2008, America would elect its first Black president, and a few years after that, not only would they have a Black president, but he would be sitting in Hanoi, eating some pho and drinking a beer, I'd say you're crazy. What's next? Is Donald Trump going to be president? Oh, as we go through life, sometimes the most unexpected things happen. So stick around, everybody. History didn't finish a long time ago. History is continuing today, and sometimes the most amazing, unexpected things can happen. That looks tasty. Okay, a big difference between previous generations. Unlike the Generation X, which had cassettes, and then later on, Generation X got really into CDs. For the millennials, no cassettes, no CDs. They would just listen to their music with MP3 files. Here I wrote, a generation's music consumption goes digital. And this was a huge shift, because in the past, you didn't download music. You had to buy individual albums. And because individual albums could be expensive, you tended to buy much less music than you wanted. You didn't have unlimited money, so you had to be much more careful in choosing which artists you would actually spend the money on. And sometimes you would buy an album and you might only like 2 or 3 songs, and the other 8 songs, but you had to pay in order to get those 2 or 3 songs that you liked. Whereas with the millennials, and this actually came after Napster. By the way, Napster came from Generation X. You could just download individual songs, and you suddenly the value of recorded music went to almost zero. And this was a big change where suddenly the millennial generation said, yes, we want to listen to music, but we don't want to pay for it. We want to share it. And this was a very big issue at the time. Check out some of the controversy regarding Napster and later file sharing programs. This is all before streaming services. The idea of what is copyright and what is pirating, and should people that share files be punished in court, these were quite significant issues at the time. Yes, cell phones at an earlier age than Generation X. Young people are spending more and more time online. And yeah, the millennials became social media pioneers. And here I'm not talking about internet pioneers, but social media. Even before Facebook and Instagram, there were things like myspace.com. Check it out. Okay. Yeah. And now the number of different social media platforms has exploded. Okay, now I just wanted to point out here that just because 2 people are of the same generation, for example, 2 people are millennials, does not mean that they are very similar, actually. Depending on where you were born, your experience as a millennial could be quite different. For example, Generation Y in Eastern Europe was the first generation to grow up after the fall of communism, which made them have a very different experience than their parents. And therefore obviously much different than someone in Australia or England or America that had grown up in a capitalist society all along. Also, countries like South Korea and Greece, they experienced a lot of economic growth. And so the kids in Generation Y had much higher standards of living than their parents in terms of economic development, disposable income, material possessions, etc. And with a country like South Korea in particular, there was a great deal of political change, the transition to democracy, obviously, from military dictatorship, which gave a very particular flavor to the experience of Generation Y. Also, a lot more experience to Western movies and Western music and related mass media than previous generations. Okay. And I think now we're heading on to Generation Z. Here we are. Finally, we've got here. So Generation Z, according to this, there are 10 characteristics. Generation Z is very social. They're very good at multitasking. They want to be entrepreneurs. Although, having asked all of my Global Communication 2 students whether they'd like to be entrepreneurs, it seems that only a minority want to start their own company. So that take that with a grain of salt. They're quite well educated. They're philanthropists, meaning they want to do some kind of good for the world. Yeah, digital natives, yeah, the screenagers. According to this, it says this generation spends 15.4 hours per week on their smartphones. I think that must be a mistake. It's much more likely they spend 15.4 hours per week on their smartphones. Interactive, tech-savvy, less focused. Generation Z, what does it say here? It needs continuous updates and stimulation. It's no surprise that Generation Z has an attention span of 8 seconds. If that is true, I wonder how many times you have been distracted during this lecture. Also cautious. Yeah, this goes back to what it says in the book about the generation forged during the Great Recession. Yeah, as a result of growing up during the Great Recession, Generation Z tends to be much more careful with their expenses. 57% would rather save their money than spend it. Okay, so Generation Z were born between 1996 up until about 2011, so roughly the start dates. Young people today, from elementary school students to young adults in their mid-20s, could all be classified as Generation Z. And I think it's kind of interesting to write about different generations. I'm going to bring the lecture now more towards the writing side. I've talked about the baby boomers, Generation X, Generation Y. We've also looked at Generation Z. It's really easy for people of different generations to have difficulty understanding each other. And that's because they grow up in circumstances that are so different from each other. People grow up in very different experiences, with very different experiences and very different, not only levels of technology, but the social environment, the political environment, their idea of what the future is going to be like. Are they optimistic or pessimistic? These are all different from generation to generation. And yeah, these generations not only vary greatly in terms of parenting styles, personal values, and familiarity with digital technology, but they also have a great deal of difficulty understanding each other. Okay, so if you wanted to compare two generations in your own country, you might look at pop culture, the music and the movies that were popular in one generation compared to another. You might look at family, meaning, for example, family size. How many brothers and sisters did people have when they were growing up? What about the average age of marriage? When did people get married? What sort of social movements or politics influenced that generation? What was the economic situation like? What was people's lifestyle like? What were the defining moments and experiences? Just to quickly recap, for the baby boomers growing up, experiences with drugs, protesting the war, the civil rights movement. These were defining experiences of their generation. And things like when John F. Kennedy was assassinated and Martin Luther King was assassinated, and John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert, was also assassinated. Things like that became defining moments. They're things that everybody remembers where they were when they heard about something, and it created a shared sense of experience. Okay, culture, if you want to compare the culture of one generation to another, how has the culture changed? Are there any attitudes or behavior that have stayed the same? Or what's changed? What was acceptable then, but not now? Or what was not acceptable then, but is now? These could include things like gender roles, food, behavior in public, school life, attitudes towards homosexuality or living together before marriage, racism. Here's an easy one. Ask your parents what it was like growing up in school when teachers could still hit you. It was a very different experience. Now, one of the first Korean movies that I watched when I first became interested in Korean culture a long time ago was called Chingu. And it's about these kids growing up. They later on become gangsters in Busan. And there are a few scenes early in the movie when they're in high school and the teacher hits them. And it's shocking. Okay, how about pop culture? How have movies and music changed over the years? What genres were popular then compared to now? How about the content? What sort of technology exists now that didn't exist before? I mean, an easy thing to say is, CG. A lot of modern movies have more CG than earlier movies, but you could compare the quality of CG. You could take a look at different practical effects. You could look at the content of different movies or how certain styles were more popular than others. What about fashion? What was cool in fashion a long time ago, but would be considered, fashion terrorism today? You could compare fashion between two generations. And you could point out that some fashions, this is significant, some fashions come back. So what was fashionable in one generation later on goes out of fashion, but then it comes back as a sort of retro fashion. You could take a look at politics. How has the political situation changed between generations? How have these changes affected people's attitudes, their actions, and their social lives? How about the political situation? Has the political situation in your country become more open, or has it become more repressive? How about economics? Have things gotten better or worse from the last generation? Was it easier or more difficult to find a job or to buy a house? Were people more optimistic about the future then or now? One thing that I've noticed talking to a lot of Korean students over the last few years is that they're very aware that they have some wonderful technology that their parents did not have, and their grandparents didn't have. But there's a sense of envy for the optimism that their parents or grandparents had grew up with. People in the 80s and 90s in Korea, even the 70s, probably even before then, had a sense that their lives were getting better, that the economy was getting better, that things were developing, that their children would have a better life than they had had. And in many cases, that doesn't seem to be the case now. Okay, society, do people live very differently compared, if you compare the previous generation to now? What kind of homes do people live in? When do people usually get married and have children? Do people get married and have children? How do people get information? How do young people start romantic relationships now compared to previous generations? It's quite interesting that when we had the class on love and relationships a couple of weeks ago, the conversation class, I asked students, do you think it's better to meet someone in real life first or meet them online? everybody said that it's better to meet someone in real life. Is this something that you still have in common with previous generations, despite the development of, dating technology on smartphones and the internet? Okay, what were some of the defining moments of different generations? You could compare certain things that people growing up in a certain time will always remember. For example, someone growing up in Generation X in South Korea would always remember the 1988 Seoul Olympics. It was a huge thing. In 2002, the millennials would say the same thing about the Japan Korea. Oh, did I just say the Japan Korea? The Korea Japan World Cup. What events or social movements changed the way that people thought of themselves, their country, and the world during that time? Okay, for most of the lecture so far, I've looked at things as they were in most of the time Western countries. I talked about how baby boomers grew up in Western countries, Generation X, Generation Y, and then into Generation Z. I'd like to take a look back at how Korean society has changed over the years, because Korea has experienced an awful lot of change in a relatively short period of time. Here's a picture which I think says a lot. A picture says 1,000 words, so they say. This says Seoul 1950년대 후반, so the second half of the 1950s. And this is a street in Seoul. It's unpaved. It's a dirt street. Poverty is very, very evident. This is what it was like in the immediate years after the Korean War. Moving on now into the 1960s, you can see fashions starting to change. Some fashions that we hope don't come back. Something which people might find hard to imagine now is a time when the government had restrictions on how many centimeters above the knee a woman could have a skirt or dress. And the police had rulers, and they would go up to women and measure how many centimeters above the knee their skirt or dress was. And a woman could be arrested if she had a skirt that was too short or a dress that was too short. And it wasn't only the women that had restrictions. Men had limits on how long they could grow their hair. And the police could actually carry clippers, and they could give men haircuts on the street if they found that they had hair that was too long. It was considered almost a social crime, I guess, if you had hair that was too long. You were a hippie, you were a subversive, and you were, what does it say here? I'm going to read, this is from the Korea Times. Those having their hair cut are not women, but men imitating the hippie. Police yesterday launched a move to get rid of such hippie youths with long hair and those who carry exhibitionism to an extreme. Now, I'm part of a Facebook group that sometimes talks about Korean history. And some of the people were in Korea a long time ago. And this one old timer talked about when he was an exchange student at Yonsei University in 1973. So I took a screenshot and I've got it here. I'm just going to read this to you because I think this anecdote is quite amusing, and it talks about a time which has since disappeared into history. In 1973, the Minor Offenses Act bans men from having long hair. Women cannot wear skirts shorter than 17 centimeters above the knee. In the first year alone, an estimated 12,000 men get their haircuts on the street or in police stations. It is bizarre to witness. It is even stranger to experience. I'll explain. One night, I'm in Myeongdong with my university friends. and in our usual post-sundown state, we are feeling no pain. What he means here is they were drunk. They were in Myeongdong. The sun was down, so it's nighttime, and they're drunk. We are passing by a local police box, and my friends dare me to stick my head into the door and shake my long hair to protest this ridiculous new law. And he's a foreigner, remember? Why not, I say, and I smile. And then I opened up the door to the police box and I shake my long hair, and the police pulled me inside and cut my hair. Random chunks of hair are cut off by an officer in charge. How dare you do this to a foreigner, I say. But the police officers laugh and they point to the Yonsei University badge on my shirt. You are a student here, which means you are a Korean resident, which means you must obey Korean law, they say, and then they kick me out the door. My astonished friends greet me with laughter. Unamused, I am not one bit happy with my new look. The next morning, I show up on Yonsei campus and receive more smiles than I have ever received before. And someone yells at me with affection, "Hey, Yankee, now you are a real Yonsei student." That's real history. Okay, if you want to take a look at a picture which shows very clearly how Korean society has urbanized and developed in a very short period of time, look no further than this picture. This is Apgujeongdong in 1975. I have a coworker at Sagang University who said to me, oh, Stephen, I remember when it was like that. She's older. I remember when those first high-rise apartments were going up and you actually could still see like a cow in a field in Seoul in the 1970s as the economic development started to increase. Moving into the 1980s, belly shirts, 1980s style. They're back in 2022. The shoes, not so much. I mentioned the Olympics a little while before. Yeah, one of the big memories of the Olympics for me as a Canadian was the runner, Ben Johnson, who won the gold medal in the 100-meter dash because he was really fast. But then 3 days or 2 days after he won the gold medal, he tested positive for steroids, and the Olympic Committee took his gold medal and gave it to the second place runner, an American. It was Canada's shame. Anyway, for a young Korean growing up, the 1988 Olympics were an extremely memorable time, and it was a shared experience, something that brought everyone together, and people of that generation will always be able to remember. This is what a couple of 1990s young Korean guys would look like. And just a quick note, you see that sort of big, white, bulky watch on the one student's hand? Those were popular in Canada too. In 2002, when we had the Korea-Japan World Cup, another shared experience, and this was where hundreds of thousands of people would get together in small areas to cheer on the local team, where actually the Koreans did much, much better than anybody expected. And more importantly, they did better than the Japanese team. That's another story. But this is, once again, something that people, they could experience it live in person. They could also experience it on TV. And increasingly, they could experience it on the internet. They could see what was happening. They could read news updates, and it was an exciting time. Generation Z, remember the term screenager? Well, screens, everywhere we go. Generation Z, one of the most defining aspects of this generation is how much of their lives they experience in the digital realm or the virtual realm. I mentioned defining experiences and memories. These are not always positive. Sometimes there are great tragedies that occur, and these, although they're not ones that people want to remember, often become defining moments of a generation too, things that people will not forget. Oh, here's another mass gathering. This was in Kwangwamun. This was not for a soccer game. This was for a political protest. This was one of the protests which brought about the impeachment of the former president, not Park Chung-hee, sorry. Oh, her name's just suddenly slipped from my mind. Park Geun-hye, sorry. Okay, and here's a picture which, until a couple of years ago, wouldn't really be significant. In 2019, if somebody saw this picture, they would think, oh, it's the winter. The microdust or the misemonji is a problem. That's why people are wearing masks and maybe covering their noses. But this is not in 2019, it's in 2020. And sometimes, actually oftentimes, the defining experiences of a generation come about with very little advance warning. This is when COVID first began to become extremely problematic or very common in Korea, and people were getting very worried about getting infected. Then, of course, we have the vaccine, which has had some level of success. Definitely not perfect, but the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic as a high school student or as a university student, I think is very significant because it's something which previous generations did not have. For example, earlier generations in Korea experienced life as a high school or university student as, living under a military dictatorship, or the unsteady transition into multi-party democracy and the struggle for democracy and lots of political protests, the economic uncertainty after the 1997 IMF crisis, and others. For Generation Z, having 2 years essentially isolated from most of society, not going to class and having very little social contact and having to cover their masks. And even now in November 2022, people are still wearing masks. I think this is something that people will be discussing in many years to come. It's also one of the reasons why I strongly suggest that students keep some sort of diary or a blog, because your experience of the 2020s is a primary source. It's a first-hand account. In the future, historians will look back and read the first-hand accounts of people who lived through this time, and your voice can be one of those. Whatever you're experiencing in the 2020s, write it down. Keep a record. Bear witness to the time of your generation. Okay. Phew. Okay, I've been talking for a long time. Oh my gosh, I've been talking for, it seems like 3 hours. I hope that you're still with me. Every time I do this lecture, I always forget to say something, and then I say something else that I didn't say in another lecture. I'm sure there are little bits of what I wanted to say about the baby boomers and Generation X, Y, and Z that I forgot to say, or I didn't say as well as I wanted to. But I'm doing this live. It's one take, so this is the best that I could do. All right, so this now brings me to your fourth homework assignment. This is what I'd like you to do. I would like you to write a compare and contrast essay about one of the following options. Number one, compare and contrast two generations in the same country or culture. So you could do baby boomers and Generation Xers in America or Korea, or if you're an international student and you want to do two different generations in your own country and write about them, that's fine. Or you could write about one generation in two different countries. Like you could write about millennials in Japan and Mexico, if you're very familiar with Japan and Mexico. Or Generation Z in Russia and Australia. Or Generation X in Vietnam and Korea. Or the baby boomers in, what else could I say? In China versus England, whatever it is, that's what I'd like you to do. Either two generations in the same country or culture, or one generation in two different countries or cultures. Now, you can choose either a point-by-point style essay or a similarities and differences essay. So either get 3 bases of comparison and then look at the similarities and differences for each, or do a similarities and differences essay where you'll have the similarities in one paragraph, the differences in another paragraph, and then the most significant difference or similarity in the third body paragraph. It's up to you. I'm looking for 500 to 600 words, and I'd like you to complete it and upload it by 11:59 p.m. That'll be Saturday, November the 12th. I'm going to give you a lot of time to do this. So, yeah, 2 generations in one country. So you might do, millennials and Generation Z in Korea, or you might do 1 generation in 2 different countries. This is especially interesting if you've lived in 2 countries and you know how 2 generations or 1 generation in those 2 countries, is either very different for some interesting reasons or similar. Completely up to you. However, a quick note, do not just list completely obvious similarities and differences. You might remember from my previous PPT, I talked about interesting, surprising, and relevant similarities and differences. Tell me something that, don't be like, no, I'll leave that. Also, don't compare 2 generations in 2022. Let me say that again. Do not compare 2 generations in 2022. For example, if you do option 1, do not tell me that Generation X did not have modern technology. Generation X had the modern technology of Generation X. In their context, it was modern. Generation Z has different technology. So I'm looking for you. Also, don't, for example, talk about Generation X and Generation Z in 2022, as in Generation Z or Generation X cannot use smartphones very well. I want you to look at the 2 generations when they are approximately the same age. So, for example, Generation X as a university student and Generation Z as a university student, like early 20s. Yeah, don't compare them in the same year. I don't care about of course a 50-year-old is different from a 20-year-old, but what about the experience of being 20 years old now compared to 20 years old, during the Seoul Olympics, something like that. So keep that in mind. Phew. And I think I'm just about at the end of my presentation. Wow, I went on for much longer than I expected. Thank you very much for staying here and watching to the very end. I'll post this up on Cyber Campus shortly. I hope you enjoy it. I'll see everybody next week in our class. So that will either be Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on which section you're in. If you have any questions about writing assignment 4, please put it in the group chat on Sagang Tok Tok, and I'll answer it as soon as I see it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see everybody in our next class. Bye-bye.